When we are talking about the media, though, and the way in which it portrays the Human Rights Act, based on negative aspects and the negative stories, one wonders if you actually ask a person on the street what the Human Rights Act actually contains. You gave a list of the rights, some of the rights. If they clearly know, they speak of it as if to suggest it's something that's imposed on this country, as if it's a foreign instrument that has been placed here, not recognising that England was at the forefront of its creation. No one seems to want to recognise that it's, what's his name, Sir David Maxwell Fyfe, from the Conservative Party, who was actually one of the architects of this human rights. And my question is, do we have the means by which we could be educating individuals out there to understand what human rights genuinely is supposed to be about, or the human rights legislation is generally supposed to be about? Because even if it's removed, we are still connected to the European Convention of Human Rights. There was still that connection. So are we going to be removing ourselves from that too? And if that is the case, it's actually about England being picky, or picking and choosing about those elements of what it considers to be in its favour when it comes to addressing human rights issues.
The way that the Act's worded at the moment is that our national legislation actually trumps the Human Rights Act anyway.
Yes.
So it doesn't override what we already have. When the government backed down on the issue of indefinite detention for foreign prisoners, it did that because of the House of Lords saying it was incompatible with the Human Rights Act back in 2004. But it didn't have to. It could have just gone its own way and it would still be compatible with British law because it makes the laws. But it brings a lot of pressure to bear on the government, and it would be in contradiction of the convention itself, and legally, morally, it would be in a very bad place. So I think that's why it's so important ultimately. But as you said, it doesn't actually trump British law as it is, and so in that sense, it's not actually they're not actually making that bargain.
And just to say a little further on what you were saying about the media, I mean, I think you're right. I think it's difficult to educate people when you have such a bias, certainly print media, and I think our broadcast media, I'm thinking specifically about the BBC because that's the publicly funded broadcaster, I think often feels that its hands are tied in what it can say. And I say this as a great supporter of the BBC, but I think also occasionally they do make wrong decisions. So, for example, the fact that they won't refer to Daesh as Daesh, and their reasoning for that is because it's not for the BBC to take sides, and ISIL don't like being called Daesh. And I think, well,
how do they know this?
You know, I mean, come on, BBC. You know, even David Cameron just last week finally started calling Daesh Daesh. And also in coverage of things like, speaking of the Syria vote for airstrikes on Syria, there was a big demonstration in London prior to the weekend, I think prior to that, to the vote, and it got hardly any coverage at all. And so again, you have a very, very free majority right-wing press. And then to counter that, you don't have very much really, and I think that's a problem.
Can I come in on that just a little bit? Because I think it ties in with what people were saying about young people and how they access the news. Actually, more and more news is accessed through social media, and I think that undercuts, to some extent, the power of the media, because less and less people are reading newspapers, less and less people sit down to watch the evening news on television. And so, more and more, it's social media, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, that feeds into people's
And they're saying
news.
social media journalism, especially when the government's cut off the communication channels. People were finding out what was happening inside Egypt, wasn't it, at the time, because people were posting it on social media. So yeah, important to tap into the channels that most youngsters, they don't watch BBC One, BBC Two, 3, 4.
No.
They are looking at the internet channels. I think that's definitely the way to go.